Welcome back to Senate Education. It is Tuesday, March 9th, 3:31 in the afternoon. We are going to continue with our return to our work on H81. Before we do that, Senators, we will probably have a little more testimony on S100, but I certainly will be looking tomorrow for your guidance with regard to what direction you would like to move in. There are different ways we can take a look at this. We can certainly send it out with the approval of the committee. We can send it out without recommendation. In other words, we want to advance it along the process, but we don't have enough time to really dig into the work, but certainly don't want to hold it up. And then we could always, we could vote it out with a negative recommendation, and of course it can be amended. So for new senators, know that there are a range of possibilities there. I have to say, my instincts when a committee sends us a bill and has done a lot of work on it is to help to, at the very least, to advance it to the next stage. Doesn't mean it can't leave our committee in some ways with amendments, and certainly as you're reviewing the bill, feel free to propose those. But we will have to make a decision by the end of the week because this will go to appropriations. Senator Lyons, please.
We've been working on this farm to school for so long.
Yes.
The first year I was in the Senate, we worked on it. It is an important concept, but did anyone ask about whether or not we could simply ask for a certain percentage of all food spending for schools to be farm to plate, fresh foods, fresh network? And I know that it's more than that. I know it's covering all the kids, but we also, the concerns that I've heard from some of the schools in my district is that there are kids who just don't need to have that support, and that money could best be used by another district and another set of kids who have those needs. So I don't know how we resolve some of those issues. Anyway.
Yeah, no, it's a good point.
Yeah.
And we'll continue this conversation later in the week. With that, we will now return to H81. Ms. Soares, you were probably in mid-sentence, so I apologize. But if you don't mind picking up where you left off, we'll then return with Mr. Salzgiver, Mr. McNeil, Neil O'Dell, and then Jeff Fannin. So knowing that we have less than an hour, I'm going to have to move us along. So with that, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I believe I concluded talking about generally the health plans being more generous now, people paying less in premium and out of pocket in 2021 than they would have been paying for 20% premium of the 2017 plan if you had adjusted that premium 6 1/3% every year for medical trend. And when you have such generous HRAs, having the same out-of-pocket cost share for employees at all levels of position, I think is reasonable and aligns with Act 11's goal, which was to have the same premium and out-of-pocket cost share, and the fact that we now have the same access to health coverage for all employees. The second thing I wanted to talk about, which I know was a topic a little bit when the bill was introduced, was actuarial value. So I think we all learned about actuarial value, or at least I did, in 2014 when Vermont Health Connect came online. And the AV, actuarial value, allows us to compare health plans rather quickly to determine whether a plan has higher premium, which means lower out-of-pocket costs, or lower premium, which means higher out-of-pocket cost. The platinum plans on the exchange have an AV of 90%. So that gives us some information about how to quickly compare with a bronze plan that has an AV of 60%. The VI plan that closed in 2017 that I just talked about had a 95% AV. When you add an HRA to a health plan, you actually increase the AV of the health plan because you're shifting costs away from the employee, which is what AV is based upon, what the out-of-pocket costs are for the employee. You're shifting those costs to the employer with the HRA. So when you do that, you're changing the AV of the health plan. The more dollars you put in an HRA, the greater the AV of the health plan. And this is a dynamic that actuaries take into account when they price health plans. The current AV of the health plans in 2018 with the HRA, and I showed you that visually on the slide before a little while ago, is 98% for unlicensed employees and 97.5% for licensed employees. I'm not aware of any plan available to any other Vermonters that has a higher AV. So AV is an important benchmark. VHI has to take the HRA and the AV into account when it sets its premium rates, because as I said, when you have a higher AV plan, you have a higher premium. And if VHI did not adjust for the HRA, VHI would have a loss, and that loss would mean that VHI needs to increase premiums the next year, both to collect money that it lost the first year, plus increase to make sure the next year they don't lose money again. And in fact, half of the increases to VHI's premiums, they've had double-digit increases for 4 years, or close to half of it, has been this trying to catch up with the HRA value. So because it's important to VHI to know that, the Blue Cross actuaries are already calculating the AV of the health plans with the HRAs. That's how I know the 98.1% and the 97.5%, because it is in the public record if you attend VHI board meetings or watch them online or look at the materials that get sent out by VHI. So the base information about the actuarial value is already calculated by Blue Cross because VHI needs to know it to set their premium rates. So the request to add language to H81 to have the AV value included and known by both parties is really about the incremental change in AV up or down that either side would propose. And I think it's important for both sides to realize that when you're saying we should have an HRA that does this, it goes up or it goes down or whatever you want to talk about as you talk back and forth, you understand how that is going to impact future premium increases. And so what we're looking at is really the incremental difference. And the employer commissioners has asked VHI and Blue Cross to provide us with the formula they use so that we could simply say, what if the HRA was worth $200 less or $200 more? How would that change? So we don't think it's a significant burden. In fact, we think it's critical because right now in law, in Act 11, the arbitrator or arbitrators must consider the comparable benefit being proposed by each side to Vermonters. What are comparable plans available to other Vermonters? And AV is a benchmark to allow that to happen. It's the benchmark that we use in Vermont Health Connect, and it's an acceptable benchmark. So I think that's reasonable, and it won't be cost prohibitive because it doesn't require a full actuarial analysis.
Okay, and I'm going to ask you for your concluding comments soon, only because we are tight on time.
Yep.
Thank you.
So I have spoken to this, but I wanted to just emphasize it, that the decisions the commission makes around the value of the HRA does impact premium. As I said, nearly half of VHI's premium increases have been a result of trying to catch up to these rich HRAs that are more generous than anyone anticipated. And we can control healthcare costs through how we bargain around them. Now, I know most of healthcare costs are driven by things outside of our control, and that's why we have the Green Mountain Care Board and One Care Vermont and all the work we've been doing. I understand specialty drugs are driving healthcare costs and the fee-for-service model. So those are things that we can't control. But We have 34,000 covered lives in these plans that we're talking about. And small decisions by a lot of people can add up. If half of those 34,000 lives could change a behavior that saved $100 in a year, that's $2 million in premium. And $2.5 million in premium can save or $2.5 million can save 1% off of a premium increase the next year. So how can you make those changes? You can make sure that x-rays aren't being duplicated. You can make sure you have a generic medication. In fact, VHI just put out a flyer about that. So there are lots of ways that we can individually help bring down costs that we don't do if we have an HRA that covers all or most of our costs, or that covers so much of our costs before we pay anything that we aren't sensitive to costs. If I go to the pharmacy and I pay nothing because
Ms. Soares, with all due respect, this is not the healthcare committee. I mean, we know the ins and outs of this, and it's tight. So let's stick to the bill and what we're trying to do.
But what it shows is that having information for the arbitrator will impact future costs, which is an education policy issue. And my very last comment, and I will just say that it's in my written testimony, is that Representative Waltz indicated that the premium was going up 11% this year, and one of our most popular plan going up 18%. Actually, the most popular plan is going up 9.6%, and overall premiums are going up 9.8%. So I wanted to make sure that that was in the record, and I open up to any comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for Ms. Soares? Mr. Salzgiver.
Okay, thank you, Chairperson Campion and members
Thank you.
of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jim Salzgiver. I'm chair of the Bennington Rutland Supervisory Union and a member of the Taconic and Green Regional School District Board. The BRSU is responsible for educating about 2,200 students in southwestern Vermont. I believe you all should have received my written testimony. And what I'm trying to do is provide a little bit of sort of general background for you guys, thinking that would be helpful to your deliberations. So for many years before Act 11, like other school districts in Vermont, at the BRSU, we negotiated with our school employees every several years to come to an agreement on healthcare benefits, salaries, and working conditions. Some school districts in Vermont probably take a confrontational approach to negotiations. I expect that would be a real minority of districts. And at the BRSU, we've instead worked hard, as have our employees, to build a positive relationship for negotiations. With that relationship building, our school employees have built confidence that we value them, we care about them, and we always want to be fair with them. But they also know that we represent many other stakeholders beyond our employees. We also represent our students and families, our community members, and the taxpayers in our communities. And our employees know that every year, our school board, one of its biggest jobs is to balance those obligations to all those different constituencies and put a budget together and present it for approval by our voters. Employee costs are a big issue, as they're roughly 80% of our operating costs. But our employees know that we have a genuine interest in looking out for their best interests while also presenting a budget that our communities will support. That positive relationship has been instrumental in allowing us to navigate some major changes before Act 11 in negotiations in recent years. First, with Act 153, Act 154, and later Act 46, we shifted from district by district negotiations to negotiating at the supervisory union level. That was a big change. We had to harmonize employment terms across multiple districts, and they were very different from one another. It wasn't easy, but our good and solid relations with our school employees allowed us to make the change successfully while maintaining that positive relationship. Then came an even bigger change with the Affordable Care Act. The ACA did away with the healthcare plans, as Laura had mentioned, that we provided to most of our employees. The ACA shifted everyone away from plans where the beneficiaries had a very low cost share. And the rationale was pretty clear: to bend the healthcare cost curve by incentivizing users of healthcare to be more cost conscious. But it was still a heavy lift in negotiations, and it was a real test of our employee-employer relationship. And, you know, honestly, like everyone else in Vermont, teachers are not all that fond of change. But it was clear that change was going to have to happen. And as school boards and employers, we recognized the need to mitigate the burden of the cost shift that the new plans would put on our school employees. Luckily, we had some very smart, and we have some very smart and talented people at the BRSU business office, and they helped us understand that this change was actually an opportunity for us, that we could produce a win-win outcome. We could combine the new health plans and health savings accounts to give our employees a very fair replacement for their old healthcare benefits that they could view as a win for them, while our districts and school budgets could also achieve a degree of cost savings, so a win-win on each side. It was a tough negotiation, and we needed to make some adjustments along the way in negotiations, but ultimately we concluded one of our most challenging negotiations ever with the holy grail of negotiations, an outcome that both parties considered a win-win. So then we had, with that experience under our belt, the idea of statewide healthcare negotiations come up. And a lot of us as school board members felt hopeful that that could actually lead to a win-win on a statewide basis, which would be great for students, great for school employees around the state. And in our district, we knew that we had proven that a win-win outcome could be achieved. We also took comfort in the intent language in Act 11 that stated, it is the intent to transition to a more equitable healthcare coverage statewide in a manner that is fair and practicable for all parties involved. So that gave us some comfort. We also had at that time a recent and more tangible expression of what the legislature was thinking, what the legislature was thinking, and that you guys felt that a win-win was possible, and not only possible but expected. That was, as was mentioned earlier, Act 85 of 2017 was a response to the ACA. And in that legislation, basically what it meant, all Vermont school districts were actually charged in their budget years of 2018 and 2019 for the healthcare recapture, which was to return the savings that it was assumed that we would make and return those savings through healthcare negotiations and return those to the Ed Fund. So that seemed like a pretty clear indication of legislative intent and an expectation of a win-win outcome at the statewide level. So many board members like myself were hopeful that statewide negotiations would achieve a win-win at the statewide level. Now, the first round of statewide school employee healthcare negotiations, frankly, seriously deflated those hopes of many school board members like myself. The two biggest takeaways from those negotiations were, one, there was no win-win financial outcome. And at the BRSU, we actually lost our earlier win-win with respect to the ACA. That went away. And the second key takeaway was the arbitration process did not work well. To give you on that win-win, to give you an idea of just at the district level, the impact on finances. I mean, healthcare cost pressures on school budgets aren't new. But this negotiation ramped up the pressure in our current budgets and also our concern about future budgets. At the BRSU over the past several years, health benefit costs have been growing roughly twice as fast as our overall operating budget, and that's with a stable number of employees. And in just a few years, health benefit costs in the BRSU have grown from 14.8% of our total operating costs to 16.3% of our total operating costs. And, as Bridget had mentioned, that led us to find other areas to cut. Now, we're also concerned because in future years, we're exposed to some potential even bigger hits. That exposure comes from a good news, bad news sort of story. With this agreement, as has been mentioned, higher level and higher cost health plans were made available to more of our lower paid employees. The good news is we're happy to have those employees having expanded access to healthcare. But the potential bad news is that our future budgets could really be hit hard. Not that many of those employees switch to higher level plans this year, but every one of them has the right to do so in future years. To put that in context, an average lower paid employee at the BRSU earns about $17 an hour, which is a bit more than $23,000 a year. If that employee chooses a family plan for health insurance, the cost of the BRSU is a bit more than $28,500 a year. And that's actually for a non-licensed employee, it's about $2,600 higher than for a licensed employee. So as I noted, not a lot of people made the shift in year one, but everyone has that right. And so that's a big cost exposure that we're facing going forward. Another financial concern is the one, as Laura Soares has mentioned, the nature of the plans has really put pressure on healthcare premiums. And that's a cost that's borne by both the employee and the employer. But the big point today is really the second takeaway, that the arbitration process didn't work well. And I would suggest is desperately in need of some fixes. As I suggested with our negotiation experience at BRSU, the best and fairest outcome to a negotiation will almost always be one where the parties reach an agreement on their own. If a meeting of the minds between the parties can't be reached, then your backup, arbitration, needs to be a clear and a fair process. Any weakness in the arbitration process will lead to a subpar arbitration outcome. From the start, this negotiation process did not appear destined for a meeting of the minds between the parties. And that's, really unfortunate. In a perfect world, one would hope that we could get to the point where arbitration wouldn't be necessary. But I just can't see that happening anytime very soon. So again, if we're relying on arbitration, the arbitration process needs to be very clear and as fair as possible to achieve the best outcome for everyone. And so what needs to be considered in arbitration? It's really the impacts on each party. And those I would just shorthand for employees. It's the quality of benefits provided to those employees and the cost of benefits to those employees. On the employer side, and for the stakeholders that we represent, it's also the quality of the benefits provided to employees, but it's the cost of those benefits to the employers. So a fair arbitration process really needs to consider both of those impacts to the employee and the employer side. And honestly, when the arbitration process is the last best offer process, as this one is, it's even more important that the arbitration process is truly clear and fair. If an arbitrator could choose elements from each party's offer, then it would be a lot less important. But in a last best offer arbitration, if the process is skewed, then one party won't feel the pressure to truly provide a best offer in their last best offer. And honestly, one should also expect that their focus would shift to managing the arbitration decision from the presentation of their last best offer. The current law based on Act 11 did, as it's been brought up, suggest that arbitration should be considering the impact on both parties. In my written testimony, I actually lay out the 5 factors that are to be considered by the arbitrator. And they do include things like the financial ability of the ed fund and school districts to pay the costs. It also includes a comparison of benefits of school employees with benefits of similar employees in the public and private sectors in Vermont. But just an observation, it appears that that provision of the law was underappreciated or somewhat overlooked in the first round. Unfortunately, we can't really know that because also, as has been pointed out, the arbitrator's decision didn't provide any rationale for the decision. I also understand it, I don't know whether this is accurate or not, but that some employee commissioners may have argued during the process that the cost to school districts shouldn't be a factor to be considered by the arbitrator. So basically, where I come out on this is it really, it really wasn't clear what the arbitrator was considering. And his decision gave us no clues. And it would seem also as if there might have been some disagreement amongst the parties to the negotiation as to what needed to be considered in the arbitration process. So that brings us to H81.
Yes, and you're going to have to be very brief, Mr. Salzgiver.
Yeah,
I
okay.
did tell Ms. Siglowski, really, we're looking at brief testimony given the incredible amount of work that this committee has between Fridays.
Apologies. Okay. So, basically I'll get down to in my written testimony, I laid out the couple of items from the House General had looked at H81 next to H63. H63 had provisions that I believe are important to ensure that the arbitration process is clear and is fair. That's really what they're trying to get to. But at the same time, so you can find those in several different places. Basically, though, I want to leave you with, it's important for you guys to understand that school boards are actually on the side of employees. They're one of the constituencies that we serve. So every school board member that I know has the greatest respect for school employees, a real interest in making sure they get a fair deal. We can't do our job if we don't maintain a high quality and motivated staff in our schools. But we also represent other constituencies, and that's why it is so important to us that that this arbitration process be a totally fair process, get the kind of outcome we're looking for, which is hopefully a win-win for employees and employers around the state, and also having the added benefit of making some progress on bending the healthcare cost curve. So that's thank you for your time and attention.
Questions for Mr. Salzgiver? Mr. McNeil and Mr. Odell, new information, things that we have not heard. I think we have Mr. McNeil up first.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And my primary role before your committee is just to be a resource. I was the chief negotiator for the employer side of the healthcare negotiations, and so have a fair bit of knowledge as to what happened and what didn't happen that I won't dwell on now. What I wanted to call to your attention today was what I believe to be a unintended but technical flaw in the bill as it came over from the House side. And I am referring specifically to pages 8 and 9 of the bill. I'll just set up the situation. As we were debating on the House side, the employer commissioners wanted to switch the arbitration methodology from private arbitrators to the Vermont Labor Relations Board. The employee side of the ledger did not want to do that. They wanted to keep to the AAA or to private arbitration. In conversations with the chair of the House General Committee, Representative Stevens, we both indicated that we could live with the notion of having the VLRB as an option available to the parties if they both selected it, but otherwise the panel would be the adjudicator. That sets up what I believe is a technical problem with section 2104 3 B 2. And if I could just frame it, it says that if the commission is unable to agree on an arbitrator, it shall request the Vermont Labor Relations Board to decide matters remaining in dispute or form a 3-member panel of arbitrators to be selected as outlined. What it doesn't say, because it uses the word or, it doesn't say which is the default, which which body is utilized if the parties cannot agree. The understanding was that if we couldn't agree, it would be the panel. And I suggested in written testimony that I submitted today some language that I thought would fix that. I did run it by Vermont NEA. They take a different view than me, respectfully, as to whether this needs to be fixed. But I'd call it to your attention. We would suggest that it would be better to be fixed. And so hopefully I've followed the Doyle methodology and
Mhm.
outlined the problem and the hopeful solution to it.
Terrific. Please note, Mr. McNeil receives an A. Terrific. Questions for Mr. McNeil before we go on with Mr. Odell? Senator Terenzini.
No, not at this time. Thank you, Senator. I was just fixing my screen.
All right, all right. Senator Chittenden.
I'll try to be brief because I know, Chair, we have a lot to do. But going back to Mr. Salzgar's testimony, it seems to me that the last arbitration didn't result in a clear enough decision. What I am seeing in H81 is some new language that is stating clearly a written decision with clarity as to where they came from. So I hope that that would mitigate it. And I also am hopeful that the current language of Act 11 already does speak to many of the cost considerations that I'm not necessarily seeing as necessary if we get a clear rationale from the arbitration process with the new language in H81. So I'm wondering how much of this was just a bad experience with that arbitration where we didn't get clarity as to what they were thinking and how much it's already being rectified. And in my mind, I'm trying to evaluate the need for this additional high bar of cost quantification when Act 11 does have pretty consistent considerations. Do you have any reaction to your concern raised about the new language requiring a written, detailed summarization of the arbitration's final result?
If I could take that, I'm sorry, Jim, did you want to take it?
That's fine. Go ahead, Joe.
I would say you're correct, Senator Chittenden. The language that is in 81 now is definitely an improvement. What we don't think it does is go far enough because we don't think it recites the need for the basic balancing between access and cost containment, to put a fine point on it. And we think that if you look at the continuum from Act 85 to Act 11 to H81, that's the missing ingredient. I could be more detailed, but try to.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Odell.
Thank you, Chair Campion and committee members. I know you're pressed for time this afternoon, so I will be brief. You have my written testimony, submitted it earlier today through Jeannie, so you've got that. Three things. One is we do think that you should call for a fiscal note. And I believe, Senator Campion, you actually mentioned earlier today that you were going to do that. So we think that that would be, key. And then the two items that Joe just addressed were just we think that there should be some additional guardrails around the arbitration process, and those particulars are laid out in my testimony. I'm not going to read what I provided you guys today. I'll just be brief and say, like you all, school board members are elected public officials, and every year we're tasked with the job of developing a budget. And those budgets sort of need to weigh the cost of providing the education for the kids versus our community's ability to pay for those things. And there are trade-offs involved. And so when a piece of legislation like this comes up and we see the potential that it has to add to the education fund, and thus our local budgets, we come to you and raise those issues with you and hope that they're considered. We're just looking for some additional balance in the process here. But with that, I'll cede the rest of the time, and certainly if you guys have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Committee. Questions? a lot there from all of you. Thank you. Informative, without a doubt. We may have some of you back or have your representative, Sue Siglowski, back, depending on how we move this week. But just want to thank you all for taking the time and appreciate the testimony. Seeing no questions, Mr. Fannin, who I think might be introduced as saying, talking about perhaps has a different position in some regards. I may be inaccurate in that, but appreciate you being here. Thank you. And again, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Senator Campion, and thank you, committee. Just so I'm clear, what time are you out of here?
Sure. No, thank you. I appreciate that very much. Chairs has been pushed back today to 5, so we do have a little time, but we do have to have a walkthrough of the weighting, the new version of the weighting study, which I am told may only take 15 minutes. So why don't we say we've given folks about an hour and a half, I'd say. So just take your time. The floor is yours.
I will try to be brief and understand that maybe a break for everybody would be appreciated. So with that said, I am Jeff Fannin, the Executive Director of Vermont and EA. Thank you for having me here today to talk about H81, which is a technical adjustment bill to Act 11 from the special session of 2018. And Act 11, there is intent language, but there's not the intent language that some are aspiring to here today. The intent was just to provide equitable health care. It's pretty slim in Act 11. And really what's inspired it was VSBA, the superintendents and principals and business managers were saying in 2017, the year before, that healthcare bargaining was too complex. There were multiple discussions about how complex healthcare was at the local bargaining table. It was too much for local school boards, who were all volunteer, and local educators to bargain together in their respective districts. And so that was the push in 17. We eventually came on board to the thinking in 2018. Maybe we're a little bit slow, but we got there. And Act 11 was passed. And so what's going on here in Act 81 is what we would think of as modest technical adjustments to a new law. That's only, we've had one round of bargaining that concluded in December of 2019 by statute. And those new plans from that decision from the arbitrator just came on board January 1 of this year. So just because of the cycle and that sort of thing, the new plans just came on board last month, or 2 months ago, excuse me. And what we're talking about here in the next round of bargaining.
Mr. Fannin, I just need you to clarify, when you're talking about the new plans, you're talking specifically about healthcare plans.
Just healthcare plans.
Okay.
So the new plans, when I talk about the new healthcare plans for all school employees, was some parts were effective last summer, but in large measure, everything was effective January 1 of 2021, just 2 months ago. And so that's what everybody's now coming on board with, these new plans. And incredibly, bargaining begins this April for plans that will become effective January 1, 2023. So for example, the fiscal note today, if you were to request it, would be speculative at best and trying to estimate what the healthcare costs for all school employees will be January 1, 2023, and to a minimum through December 31st, 2025. Right, all agreements have to be no less than 2 years per Act 11, and we're not that's not being proposed to be changed in H81. So it's very speculative. Healthcare is very costly. We acknowledge that. I think everybody around this table would acknowledge that healthcare is very costly, and certainly Senator Lyons and her committee would acknowledge that and struggles with it. We've been at this for more than a decade, and we think that if we want to have those larger conversations, let's go have them in Senator Lyons' committee and health and welfare and have that rich discussion there. What we're talking about here is a bargaining law, the rules of the road about how the employers, the school boards, provide health insurance for their school employees. And that's what we're talking about here in the process by which we do that. That's what this bill would modify, is the existing law, Act 11, in those rules of the road. So that's all. That's what H81 would do. And it's very similar to S226 from last year that passed the Senate, came out of this committee, Senate Education unanimously, I think it was, appropriations as well, and then on the floor just before the pandemic, and then right afterwards on a voice vote. So it's been pretty well vetted. I think there were 6 revisions last year, S226 that is, and H81 in the House was introduced, was identical to S226. Now there were some changes, modest as they were, in the House General Committee, and then passed with a tri-party vote just a few weeks ago in the House. So it's the real rubbing point, I think, is found in Section 4 of the bill. And my pagination is different than Joe McNeil, so I don't want to tell you what page number it is, but it's Section 4 of H81, and it strikes. It's Section 4 at Section 2103 of Title 16, A3, and that it strikes the language that premium responsibility percentages for each plan tier shall be the same for all participating employees. And it goes on for out-of-pockets as well, a little bit later in the same section. So in other words, it strikes the requirement that all school employees, that would be administrators, managers, teachers, and school support staff, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, paraeducators, requiring them all to pay the same amount. And in the first round of bargaining, this teachers and licensed people, as we call them, and the support staff were allowed to pay different premium and out-of-pocket arrangements. Those were permissible in round 1, and the parties did discuss different things, and the arbitrator ultimately decided what he did, and I'll come back to that in a second. But it is different for teachers and support staff right now, currently in law. And every other bargaining law in the state, SELRA, the state employees, the municipal law, doesn't require that employees all pay the same amount. And Joe will respond, and he's correct, that they do in the state employees. All state employees pay the same amount. That is true. But what is not true is the law doesn't require it. The parties bargained that and came to an agreement about that. And so we're asking in it, or what H81 is doing, is allowing the parties to negotiate, like they do in the state employees or the municipal employee law, an arrangement that they can agree to. It might be the same, it might not be. And that's what H81, by striking those 2 sentences, would do, is allow the parties to bargain an arrangement that's different depending on, how they see fit. That's it. So that's the real sticking point. It does not cost anything automatically. It strikes language that allows the parties to decide it. So that's the real sticking point. Going to Joe's point about the default language of arbitrator or VLRB, we saw it differently, and Joe is correct. I mean, I sent Joe an email a couple hours ago now. We saw it differently in the House, and we think they got it right, which allows the parties to decide whether they want to go to the labor board or use an arbitrator or a panel of arbitrators. So we think it's right there as it is now in H81 that came through the House. And I'm trying to think a couple other things that were said. Yeah, I mean, I'll try to keep it short and happy to answer any questions. This is a technical correction to a brand new law, Act 11, with changes that in some cases we both sought. So, for example, the arbitrator's decision was lacking a little bit, and we both agreed that there should be more to it. And that's where there is some language about requiring the arbitrator to a bit more elaborate on his or her decision going forward. And we agree with that. That was something that the School Boards Association wanted last year. We agreed to it. That's the language that we think is appropriate. You know, as for cost containment, I think you're right, Senator Chittenden. There's language in the existing law right now, and it doesn't put a finger on the scales to tip it in one side or the other. We think it gets it right, and that's already an existing law. We don't need any, you know, imbalance in the process. That would make it unfair inherently. So we don't agree that there's any changes there needed. What we're all struggling with was the arbitrator didn't explain his decision as well as we wanted, or much at all, in fact. That doesn't mean we rewrite the law to fix that. The only thing we did adjust for is requiring the arbitrator to explicate his decision and explain it a bit more. That's the appropriate response to that dearth of a decision that we got from the arbitrator. Perhaps he was tired of us. As Joe mentioned, it was several long days of arbitration hearing, and probably he was tired of seeing everybody in front of him and just wanted to get it over with. I don't know, but now we've got a requirement in H81 that would make the next arbitrator have to explain his or her decision, and we think that's appropriate. So that is, you know, the sum of my testimony, knowing that you folks are pressed for time a little bit, and happy to answer any questions if you might have them. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Fannin? Senator Pursley.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Mr. Fannin, when we did the bill walkthrough with James, I had brought up that same thing that Mr. McNeil brought up about what happens if you don't agree on whether it's the panel or the other one, because it doesn't say what happens if you can't agree on that point. How would you see that playing out if there isn't agreement?
Well, I think the parties, you know, not everything is decided in law. I mean, the parties have struggled with other bargaining challenges that aren't decided for them in the existing law, and they get by it. So I think that it's new, but you know, stepping back, we've been doing this. You know, I talked to one of my staff who, a former elementary school teacher, Suzanne Durmeyer, who will testify tomorrow, and you can ask her this question. We've been doing this for years and years. Not every question is answered and every default is decided in law. We figure it out, and we've been doing it. And I think that'll be the case here. You know, it's a new law. And we think that both sides will figure that out, to be very honest with you. And I think they have to.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Senator Hooker.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Jeff. One of the big problems here seems to be making sure that the arbitrator is considering the costs. And we're asked to put language in H81. Is it enough to say there's language in Act 11 and make reference to that?
I don't think you need to make reference to it, but I certainly think that because I think it's there in Act 11. And it says the financial ability of the education fund and school districts across the state to pay for the cost of healthcare benefits and coverage. That's something the arbitrator has to consider. And now that we have language requiring the arbitrator to explain the decision, coupled with that language, I think is sufficient. Frankly, I mean, I don't, if you add too much on, it's going to be tipping the scales, and that's what is inherently unfair and not what a bargaining law should be about. It should be about making sure that there's balance in the system, and the arbitrator's got to weigh the financial ability of the ed fund and school districts across the state. I think that's sufficient.
So just comply with the law.
Yes, and the existing law as well as H81, if it
right
is successful, it would require the arbitrator to explain the decision.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, Mr. McNeil, please.
Thank you. Just very briefly in response to Jeff's comment. During the negotiations phase last time, not at last best offer, but during most of the negotiations phase, the employee side argued that there was no need and really no authority to be considering the cost implications of the bill and the agreement, because Act 11 did not specifically indicate that cost containment or cost control or sustainability was part of that plan. And that, particularly because of change in Act 81, moving from everyone paying at the same percentage for each tier they accept to allowing separate and distinct bargaining on that point. The thinking on the part of VSBA and the employer commissioners was that emphasis on the basic, if you will, balancing of the fulcrum between access on the one hand and reasonable cost consideration on the other is and was appropriate. And Jeff's right. The criteria does certainly say the ability, the financial ability of school districts and education fund to pay. There's a difference, however, between ability in the sense of being able to raise taxes or raise fees and whether it is reasonable to do that given the impacts upon taxpayers and the ed fund and school budgets. And so I'm sorry to be too long on this answer. I'll go down to a B minus, but what we're hoping for is an appropriate balancing between those two fundamental concepts.
Senator Chittenden and then Senator Lyons, please.
I lowered my hand to give Senator Lyons yield to her.
Oh, Senator Lyons, please.
Okay, well, I think when we first started looking at the issue of more of a statewide negotiation for healthcare, we really did believe that it would help improve access while controlling costs. So I think everyone has said that, and everyone is interested in supporting healthcare benefits for teachers and staff. And at the same time, we're all concerned about the cost to our constituents and property taxes. So I think if we're interested in taking another step in looking at healthcare and healthcare reform to reduce costs, that's something that we are doing in our committee. Senator Hooker will be a part of that. It's an ongoing discussion, but I don't think we're going to resolve it with this H81. I honestly don't. It's a tough nut to crack. It's going to continue to be that way. And I shouldn't have left out Senator Terenzini because I'm going to put him to work too. But so that's all I wanted to say. This I think for me, this becomes an arbitration bill and resolving some of the issues that we saw during the last negotiation seem important. And it's a work in progress. So keep working on it together.
Thank you for that. Mr. Fannin and then Senator Chittenden.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Senator Chittenden. I'm sorry.
This is somewhat of a process question. I'll be quick,
Please.
Jeff. Is my understanding is if we there is some interest in having this passed by April or having it signed by the governor by April 1st. If we change H81, it goes back to the House, and then I don't know. Do we even have time to consider it much, or is that a conversation for later this week when we possibly are considering action on moving this forward? I don't know how much time we have to actually make.
You know, I appreciate this question, and I would like Mr. Fannin to also weigh in since he asked that we do take it up this week and started the process prior to break. I can tell you from the corner office, from the Pro Tem's office, we want to do good work. We want to do the best work we possibly can. If that means that senators feel comfortable by the end of the week to advance this, so be it. If senators feel as though they need more time, that's also, I think, will be understood. We also know that this is going to appropriations. So that's just a little bit of from where I'm sitting, and I just want to convey to everyone. I'll let Mr. Fannin mention why he's asked for us to do this right now.
Well, I think it's important. It's a good question, Senator Chittenden. We think time is of the essence because bargaining does begin April 1. And I'm going to go back a little bit. When Act 11 was passed in 2018, we came back in 2019 seeking some of these same changes. We identified some problems early on. And at the time, the School Boards Association Executive Director Nicole Mace said, let's let one round of bargaining go through. Let's let the things simmer down a little bit and figure out what needs adjusting. And that carried the day in 2019. Last year, we came back with some of these same changes, and it got out of the Senate, started in Senate Education. This committee, started that S226, came out of there and went to appropriations, then into the floor, as I said, and was voted out unanimously on a voice vote just before and after the pandemic. And they got stuck in the House, because of that, the pandemic. So we're here on the third year in a row trying to figure out how to adjust the bargaining process, the rules of the road that we bargain. And so by delaying it, to adjust it, it's difficult for me to swallow, but I understand that you want to do the best work you can, as the chair made mention of. So acknowledge that, but time certainly is of the essence if we're going to change this, if the sides are bargaining on it April 1. And they're already starting. I know Joe has had some conversations with some folks in my office about that. So it's already started, and we think, it's time to make the change, we hope. And as for cost, I'm going to go back a step or two.
Please.
In H81, it does, include some new language that would have the sides submitting their arguments and documents and their last best offer to the arbitrator, which would now include a cost estimate for the term of the proposal with a breakdown of costs borne by employers and costs borne by employees. So there's additional requirements now on the employer and the employee side to develop cost estimates for their proposals. So it addresses Joe's stated concern, notwithstanding the language that's in existing law. So I think that, we're trying, this was language that we all kind of agree to going forward, identifying costs as being important, certainly, but not trying to tip the scale. So we think it reaches the balance of requiring the parties to put forward a bit more information, as well as the arbitrator to make a decision and explain it in better detail than he did in the first round. It's just, we think it strikes the right balance.
Mr. McNeil, you're pushing it.
Thank you.
I'm kidding.
Thank you. Very quickly, with regard to the question of timing, we agree with Jeff that expeditious action is important for negotiation, but we'd also point out that we start negotiating April 1, but by the statute itself, unchanged, we don't reach the impasse part, the meat of this, if we can't reach agreement until about June. So if there is a little bit more time needed to do it right, it's worth it. And then number two, if I could be allowed just a slight 60-minute debate forum back and forth with Jeff, I would say that while it is true that the parties are now compelled to submit evidence on those points, the arbitrator is not compelled to include those points in his decision. He's obligated to give a full explanation, but what we're asking for, very frankly, is he address the points that we're obligated to submit to him or her.
Well, I would just respond and say, Joe, that's right. And I think it's the obligation of the advocate, your case, you, and on my side, my folks, to make that argument to the arbitrator that so that he or she makes the decision based on the information brought forward. So I don't argue the point with you. I just think it's for the arbitrator to decide. And as an advocate, if now you know what you've got the challenge ahead of you is to put forward enough information to make the arbitrator buy your argument and lay it out for him or her. And I think that that's the challenge any advocate has in any forum. And I think we're asking now the arbitrator to explain why he or she decides your way or that way, one way or the other.
And admittedly, that's helpful. We'd like a little bit more. Enough said.
Thank you. Senator Perchlik.
I don't know who the question is for, but can we get clarity on that question? Because it seemed like what I understood and what Mr. McNeil said on the importance of the April 1st date are different in that I assume that once the negotiations started on April 1st, we couldn't change it. It's like the train had already left and we could change the law, but that wouldn't take effect till the next process started. Are you saying, Mr. McNeil, that if we pass the law in May and the negotiations are going on, then that change in statute would fall down upon the negotiations as they're in process?
It would all depend, Senator Perchlik, as to whether the bill took effect from passage. If the bill did take effect from passage, it could have a bearing upon where we were at that point. What I'm trying to say is I think we'll be able to work out the starting aspects of these negotiations. And I was just addressing the point of doing it right or doing it quick. We'd prefer to have it thoroughly looked at, and
Right.
That's it.
Is that, Mr. Fannin, your understanding, or?
I think that's right, Senator Perchlik. I think that if we could, in an ideal world, we'd have it done yesterday, right? I mean, and I understand that may not be the case. And so if the law changes, April 2nd, for example, the parties will adapt. And the IRS could change its rules regarding HRAs or HSAs. Parties will have to adapt. And that's outside of the control of even Vermont. So there are other outside influences that the parties perhaps have to keep their eye on. And this could be just another one, and they'd have to figure it out as they will. And the fact finding and the arbitration doesn't happen until August anyway, kind of thing. So it's later in the summer, and the arbitration later in the fall even. So there's time.
And I should just mention, from where I'm sitting, it's an H bill. If we need to, there are certain bills that we have that are must pass by Friday. If we needed an extra day or two next week, we know we have them. I'm certainly not thinking of, continuing this work in April, but again, as the chair, I recognize that there's a little bit more flexibility with this if we need more time. That being said, if there is a champion of this bill on this committee that really feels as though it needs to roll, it's not out of the question that it could roll sometime this week. But I from where I'm sitting right now, it looks like it's possible we might need a little bit more time. Please.
One quick note. I mean, so it's certainly doable, perhaps not ideal, but what we're talking about is folks bringing forward proposals, on April 1 or thereabouts.
Yeah.
For both sides, and it's affecting teachers and support staff alike. But certainly, the change here would affect the lower income support staff, and that's what we're trying to figure this out.
And I just want to make clear, and it's by no means, it's just simply an observation. The House had this bill for, again, just about a month, if not more. And it is an H bill, and in an ideal world, we would have received it a little bit earlier, given the workload, given the pandemic, given the situation out there. So the fact that they did take so long, I put my faith in the fact that they needed to take so long, that it's a complicated issue. And I'll just go back to what the corner office is telling me. We want to pass out the best work possible. And if it takes an extra day or two, and that's just the way it's going to have to be. And I think everybody accepts that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I think we'll leave it there for today. For this topic, we're just going to spend a little more time on one final topic before we leave. Thank you, Ms. Zaglowski, for organizing this, and thank you, Mr. Salzgiver, Mr. McNeil, Mr. Odell, Ms. Burkhart. I think that's everyone, and certainly Mr. Fannin for this important conversation. For those of you who have known Mr. Desmarais, as I have had the honor to know him for several years, this is an important day. Happy birthday. I just heard through the grapevine.
Thank you. Thank you.
Happy birthday. That's awesome.
I hope the day is treating you well as you have continued to treat all of us, that's for sure. Can't thank you enough for everything you continue to do for us, have done for us, and no doubt will be doing for us as we continue.
Well, thank you very much.
An important and interesting year.
It's number 60 for me, so it's a big one.
60, fantastic. Yeah, that's great. That's great. That's great. Well, congratulations and thank you. And I really do hope you have something special planned for this evening. With that, before we let you get to your evening, I'm wondering if you'd be so kind as to talk with us a little bit about a possible strike-all. And to remind senators, we are now transitioning to something we are all familiar with, thanks to our inbox, the waiting study. And this is work that I know this committee worked on last year, and something that I think the corner office would like to see us continue to work on, but there are some outstanding questions that need to be answered. And given the state of affairs in the nation as it relates to the pandemic, as it relates to other pressing issues in this committee and other committees, what I have taken the liberty to do, and please just know that it's just an idea, I have compiled questions that were sent to me by the Pro Tem's office and others, and asked Mr. Desmarais to incorporate them into a draft strike-all, as well as create a committee that would oversee the answering of these questions. And as I believe I wrote to Mr. Desmarais during the week, I think I recommended there be balance from both the House and the Senate, finance committees, education committees, as well as somebody from the state board, completely, of course, open to any changes, edits. And then I believe the way we did it, and Mr. Desmarais will take us through it, is it wouldn't be as though this group would be asking the questions. And what the way I've structured it is an RFP would be given. They would put out an RFP to find somebody to work with them to answer some of these, what I think are outstanding questions, not only from colleagues, but I think around the state before we move too far into assigning weights. So with that, I will not say birthday boy because it doesn't feel right. But Mr. Desmarais, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Jean, can I share the screen?
Yes, you can.
Thank you. Okay, so right here. Okay. Okay, bigger. Okay, so for the record, Jim Desmarais, Legislative Counsel, we're walking through a proposed amendment by the committee of S13. It's a strike-all, and it creates this task force on the implementation of the Pupil Weighting Factors Report. And the function of the task force broadly is to recommend how to implement the equalized pupil weighting changes outlined in the UVM report. Membership is 6 members, 4 members are from the General Assembly, one from Finance, Senate Finance, one from Senate Education, one from House Ways and Means, and one from House Education, each appointed by the chairs of those committees. And then, in addition to those four, the Secretary of Education or designee, and the chair of the State Board of Education or designee. So the powers and duties are to recommend again how to implement the report, and specifically shall recommend which weighting factors to modify or create and their associated weights, and whether any weight should be eliminated in lieu of use of categorical grants. 2, recommend whether and how to ensure that school districts are using funding to meet education quality standards and improve student outcomes and opportunities. 3, consider education property tax rates and the taxing capacity of school districts and how the task force's weighting factors recommendations relate to the recommendations of the Tax Structure Commission. And I should note here that the Tax Structure Commission issued a report in February of this year, which I will reference more specifically here, in the next draft. 4, recommend how to transition to the new weights to promote equity and ease the financial impact on school districts during the transition, including the availability and use of federal funds during the transition. 5, consider use of categorical aid, including whether a categorical aid should be used instead of some or all of the weighting factors, and if weighting factors are used, whether small school grants, transportation aid, and other state grant funding targeted for a specific purpose should be adjusted or terminated. 6, recommend how tuition rates for non-operating school districts and career technical centers should be adjusted to account for the cost of educating students as reflected in the recommended weights. 7, consider school funding formulas in other states and alternative models for school funding. 8, consider the relationship between the recommended weights and the changes to special education funding under Act 173. 9, consider the impact of the recommended weights on the goals and outcomes of should be 1997 Action Resolves number 60 and Act 46. The D says that the task force may retain a consultant to assist with executing its powers and duties. The report is due by January 15th of next year to you and to these other committees. And this part's very standard here. The task force would not meet more than 6 times. Administration assistance would come from AOE and usual compensation reimbursement for legislative members. And the appropriation for that is $5,400. And then B has an unknown appropriation for the consultant. And that's it. Effective date is passage.
Thank you, Jim. What I am going to ask Jeannie to do is to put this on the calendar tomorrow for about 15 minutes of a committee discussion. So it'll give senators an opportunity this evening to think about it. I know people have heard from constituents, they've heard from colleagues, and it's just one idea in terms of how to move forward with this. Keep the conversation alive, which I think is important. Senator Lyons.
So, yeah, I mean, there are differing opinions out there in our district. Some want us to just go forward as quickly as we can, but then there are also people who understand that we need to take some time on this. I had a meeting on, I don't remember when it was, last week, an early morning meeting with some of our school folks, and they did get it. The people who understand what weighting means understand the need to take some time.
Yeah.
It's the people who don't understand this, who think we should move a little bit faster. The question I have is, we did go through the development of per pupil cost and an analysis of where the weighting fits. And I'm wondering if maybe we don't need to do it again, but it would be nice to have a quick review or a single sheet that would help us just look at that, and how the proposals within the bill, the questions that are being asked in the bill, actually are influencing the final decision. So in other words, categorical funding or grants, and why are we putting that in there? So some justification for our decisions. And I know that we know that they're there, and I know that we probably intuitively can answer all of those questions, but we also know that funding is not totally intuitive. So, and it doesn't have to happen before we finish our work on this, but it would be helpful at some point over the next week or so, just to look at it while it's going down the hall.
I think that's a very good point. Mr. Demeray.
So I had presented earlier, but it's been a while now, on how the weights work. There's a PowerPoint that I did for you. I could bring that back if you want and just run through how the current weights work.
That would be great. I mean, just a
yeah.
quick refresher would be awesome. Yeah.
I think that's a great idea. We've been involved in a lot of different topics, and I think it would be great for all of us to have that review, if you'd be so kind as to do that. And I'll work with Jeannie to find a time.
Sure. Yeah.
Senator Hooker, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Thank you. I understand the need to want to do this right, and I think Senator Lyons is correct in saying that people who understand the weighting process realize that it takes time and stuff. But I am getting more and more emails from districts that are saying, we need this. Yeah. We've been losing money. And so with regard to things like categorical funding and the like, will we be looking at other ways to help sort of bridge this time between now and when we come to an agreement on weighting?
And my answer to that is absolutely. Even if, as this moves down the hall to, I think both it would go to appropriations and finance, we would indeed, we would be working with appropriations and AOE to identify those areas, those districts, if you will, those schools that would need support. So yeah, I think this is an ongoing conversation and ongoing work post crossover. I think what, just generally out there, I think constituents, Vermonters don't want the work to disappear. Not even if this were not to go forward, it wouldn't disappear. There are other ways to advance this, but given that there might be an opportunity to do some additional work over the summer. And these questions are coming up. I mean, these questions are questions from our colleagues, but we also know they're out there and they would end up being asked on the floor, some of them. And so let's try to do our due diligence before we take these next steps. Okay, so we'll find some time tomorrow, just 15 minutes, just to sort of, if everyone would just come back in and having taken a look at this and marinated on it a little bit. And then knowing that this would likely need to leave by Friday and we have a little bit more time with H81, I am going to make those adjustments accordingly in our agenda, and I'll talk to Jeannie a little bit about that. Okay, with that, Mr. Demeray, again, happy 60th. Hope it's a wonderful evening. Could we go off YouTube for a moment?